before RFA, Libby was with the NAACP, where she was a Director of Administration Strategic Planning. She has degrees from Berkeley, Wharton, many schools, and we're very happy to have her here. To her right is Diem Do, who is the chairman of VIPBAN, a Vietnamese pro-democracy organization. Diem has been a democracy activist since he was a college student. For a while, he worked as an executive in diverse industries, healthcare, entertainment, and then he became a full-time democracy activist. And I am Zui Huang. The event tonight is actually going to be broadcast live, so we have a live stream. So later on, your questions will be picked up as well. So without further ado, I think we'll start. And the format's going to be very relaxed. We'll have a conversation here. I have a few questions for the speakers, and after that, we'll open it up for the audience. So, obviously, Burma has been in the news, right, over the last several months. Secretary Clinton's gone to Vietnam, started to Burma. There's been prisoner releases. So, Libby, what exactly is happening in Burma? Can you explain it to us?
Well, what happened is they had an election in 2010 where it was a civilian election, although no members of the NLD were allowed to be candidates. And this civilian new government, which is comprised of many people that we recognize from the junta, promised great reforms. Now, we didn't believe it, but it's really coming fast and hard. And the longer they do this, the more I think the consequences are reinforcing their decisions. And so, they're releasing political prisoners. They're letting Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD run in the next elections, April 1st. They are no longer blocking Radio Free Asia in Burma. I mean, it's been really stunning, and they're actively trying to have reconciliation with the minorities who comprise a third of the Burmese people. So it's a huge opening up of a country which for 50 years has been one of the most repressive and isolated nations in the world.
And so these are sweeping changes, right? Prisoner releases,
huge
reconciliation with the opposition. What is driving this, and why have the generals decided today to have these changes? For the last 50 years, they had a policy of repression.
That is the question of the hour. I couldn't begin to try to predict, but I think that the results of their actions could give us some clues about why they went down this road. And particularly because for the last 50 years, they've had no partners and no nations that were willing to work with them and trade with them, except for China and North Korea. Now, with a country like Burma that's so impoverished, it's very hard to move your country forward if you've got no partners and you're isolated in the world. Now, since they have opened up, they've obviously garnered all kinds of, relief from sanctions, and they are opening up to the whole world, and they're able to establish other partnerships. I think that was probably a motivator. I don't know what they were thinking, but they've achieved, a lot of positive accolades in the world's radar screen.
If I may just want to jump in, of course, everybody has his or her own theory, and I have my own theory. I've kind of been watching the situation in Burma for some time, and I believe that the shift that we have seen now probably come from the result of the fact that there are people within the ruling government, the ruling regime in Burma, who would like to see Burma break free from the dependency on China.
I think it's a big factor.
Yeah, I think the first sign probably came up quite a few years ago, back in 2004. China's key man in Burma, Lieutenant General Kim was pushed out to the surprise of everybody. And at that point, nobody could have guessed that could have been the first step toward moving away from China and turning toward the U.S. and the West. And once the regime realized that it's a very uncomfortable position to be in within China's grip, and if they want to move away from that, their only choice is to turn to the West, and their only choice to break free from the isolation and the sanction is to open up the political process.
I absolutely agree. And part of that is, I think, from the ground up, because in the last few years, we've had a lot of activity from the people involving their outrage of deals that were made with China all over the country, including temple areas that were like land taken over for Chinese to build things. I mean, there has been ground unhappiness as well as the isolationism and the dependency on China. I totally agree with you.
So there's been changes. Some of it's been driven by real situations, some of it by issues of external influence because of China. Now, I mean, as a democracy activist, when you see a regime changing like this, is it sustainable? These changes that will continue, or will this be more of a short-term thing?
My gut feeling is that the reality is that we're not quite sure yet. I think that the reason why I said that it's not certain whether the change in Burma is real and sustainable is because the people in charge in Burma right now are the exact same people who have been ruling Burma with an iron fist for the last 20 years. I think it's common knowledge that the National Defense and Security Council is still calling the shot behind President Klein's side. And the military men are still very much in control of the parliament, the government ministries, as well as civil administration all the way down to the village. So with that scenario, I think it's still doubtful. I think it is doubtful that the change we are seeing right now is going to be real and sustainable. And of course, the question is, how do we win? How do we ensure it's sustainable? And I think there are a number of things. International pressure needs to be maintained. We need to keep them engaged and communicate to them that only real concrete democratic reforms will be met with more motive and more incentive and more cooperation. Promoting the development of civil society in Burma is very needed at this point in time to just help make this change sustainable. And last but not least, the opposition quickly start to chit-chat and deal with this.
Is this something you concur with?
And at Brady Information, we think that free flow of information, free press, engagement, communicating, we do 7 ethnic languages as well as the dominant language, is critical to keeping this window open. Because we do have a crack now, and we need to really take advantage of it and get as much outside information in as we can so that they can't put the genie back in the bottle.
So, touched on Burma, just to shift to Vietnam. Kurt Campbell, who's the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, is very active in the opening with Burma, was recently in Hanoi. And his press conference in Hanoi, actually, a reporter asked him, will the changes in Burma happen in Vietnam? And his response is, literally, he said, I don't have an answer for that. And so maybe we'll find an answer for that tonight. So as a Vietnamese democracy activist, do you think those changes can happen in Vietnam? Or what will it take for Vietnam to have changes?
Well, first, we must realize that the situation in Burma and Vietnam are very different. There are some major differences between Burma and Vietnam. Unlike Burma, in Vietnam, the Communist Party is the only political entity allowed to exist. All other political entities are banned, severely persecuted. Unlike Burma, the Vietnamese government do not experience any kind of sanction or isolation like the Burmese regime had to go through. To the contrary, I think the Vietnamese government enjoyed considerable cooperation from the outside world. And third, I think the Burmese economy is like Nikki had said, is in terrible shape. In Vietnam, by pursuing the Chinese model, opening up the economy, but clamp down politically, the Vietnamese government was able to keep the economy moving. And by doing so, they were able to buy some time. And they actually bought almost a quarter of a century, lingering on and hanging on. So with those differences, is Vietnam right for change? I think we're not there yet, but we're heading there. Why? Because I think the last few years we have seen some really significant changes in Vietnam. The level of public discontent with the government has risen to an unprecedented level. Not that we have seen Vietnam before. This is the first time we've seen that kind of frustration and impatience with the government. The flow of information, Radio Free Asia, BBC, the internet, have really helped give people an outlet, give them a chance to voice the discontent, and to organize as well. The pro-democracy force in Vietnam beginning to take shape and form, beginning to come out in the open and challenging the government. And last but not least, the way they handle the conflict, the territorial issue with China, really have caused people to lose trust in them and lose any legitimacy they may have left with the government, with the population. So with all of that, I think we're not there yet, but we are heading in the right direction.
You mentioned China. For a while, and the perception was the military junta in Burma was very close to China. But I think what shocked a lot of people was when the Burmese leadership suspended a huge dam project that China was about to build in Burma. It's like $4 billion, a huge dam project on the Irrawaddy River. Now, the paramount of Vietnam is there's issues of bauxite mining, and there's huge Chinese interest in Vietnam with environmental resources and so forth. So, what will it take for the Vietnamese or the Hanoi regime to make that type of calculation where the Burmese have, where they felt, well, the pressure from China is too much? Would something like that happen in Vietnam? Is it possible to happen in Vietnam?
I'd like to, I wish, but right now I don't see that as a clear, distinct possibility, because for the same reason as I mentioned before, the Vietnamese government is nowhere near in the same kind of tight spot like the Burmese government had to endure. They still have some wiggle room, they still have some room to maneuver, and I think they're not quite there yet. The challenge for us is to make that situation happen so that they have to make a choice, change or run the risk of facing being asked.
I mean, for instance, that decision in Burma, I think that really caught the outside world by surprise. Is it common for a regime to respond to public pressures, or is it because of geopolitical issues to really reverse a signature economic project because of?
That was a stunning change. It's not unprecedented, but it's one of the most startling about faces ever, especially with a country like China, on whom you're so dependent. But it's a two-way pressure that the government was under from our outside observation. With Vietnam, it's a much more difficult case, as I agree with everything you said. The economic growth and prosperity is following the Chinese model, and the only wiggle room that I see is the internet and digital communications, because the Vietnamese they did not create the internet to be filtered, and they have obviously very strict censorship, but they're still using old school tactics, jailing, and threatening people who are expressing their views. But they're not quite able to shut down the pipeline the way the Chinese did, because they came in afterwards. So I really think the hope is that as more and more people are getting online, 27 million people are online.
A quarter of the population, believe it or not, almost more than that actually.
It is, and it's growing astronomically. So there's really no limit to people wanting to be engaged and find out more information, and that creates the pressure on the ground. So when you feel like your nation, you have, as a people, nationalistic pride, and if you feel that your nation is being taken advantage of, exploited, that's what really builds a groundswell, and that's what I think happened in Burma.
I just want to chime in. I really feel, being a democracy activist, I really strongly feel that we would not be able to see the changes we see in Burma today, or the changes we have seen in Vietnam during the last 5 years, had we not have free flow of information. I cannot stress enough the importance of programs like Radio Free Asia, BBC, and so on. And recently, with the internet, it has been a powerful tool for the democracy activists. And not just as an alternate source of information, it is a tool to organize as well, the use of social media. It is a powerful tool to motivate and to mobilize. So I cannot stress enough that the role of free media, free flow of information.
Thank you. We think it's critical.
A little plug for the RFA.
Thank you so much. It also creates a platform. It snowballs on itself. When people hear their friends on the radio, then they want to get on the program. And it's a phenomenon, I think, among the young professional internet users in Vietnam. We see more and more people trying to get all our programs so that they can share it with each other. So it's our big hope. It's our big hope.
I know a number of people here have questions they want to ask the speaker. So let me ask one more question, and I'll open up to the audience here. Yes. Okay, so there's been these changes in Burma. How has that sort of affected the opinion in Vietnam, both among the leadership in Hanoi and in more Vietnamese general population, the democracy movement bloggers, how they responded, or how those changes affected them?
I've been wondering the same question to the Prime Minister of Vietnam, because a few years ago when Vietnam was still the chair of the ASEAN, at that point in time he has the audacity to advise Burma that it's time for you to open up the political process.
That's what caused the change.
Yeah. So that was good, or maybe that's what caused the change. But so I keep asking myself, they gave the advice to Burma, and now Burma is doing just that. So when is it going to be their turn? I think the Vietnamese leadership is watching what's going on in Burma with keen interest, because certainly they do not, even though they advise Burma to open up, they do not want to do the same thing. Now, the bloggers, the activists in Vietnam, of course, are very, very hopeful there might be a domino effect. What's happening in Burma eventually will come to Vietnam. I have to say, though, the general population, generally speaking, they are aware of what's going on in Burma, but to help them to make that connection between what's going on in Burma and possibly repeating it in Vietnam is up to the job of news, the free media, the news outlet, and the activists.
It is our job to make regional affairs real for people in their own lives. And the situation in Burma is one that we have broadcast across our spectrum. Because, you have situations as desperate as Tibet, where you have 21 self-immolations. They need to know that there is change possible in the world, in their region. And it's an important message that we're pushing out in all of our languages, that Burma is opening up.
It's time for North Korea, China, and Vietnam.
So it can be both an inspiration to people, but sort of caution to regimes.
Yes.
I think they're nervous.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, I mean, what do the folks here think? I mean, does anyone have a question? If you just identify yourself, then ask your question, please.
My name is Louise Wise, and I have a question about the language. You talk about how important the internet is, and social media, I assume maybe even Facebook. And what I'm wondering is, are these people, let's say in Vietnam or Burma, are they communicating in their own language of their country, or are they mostly communicating in English?
In the native language.
In their native language. And they're able to do that. There's no problem in terms of using the electronic media for
No,
them.
the fonts are quite versatile.
Okay.
Yeah, and so as you can imagine, the effect of the internet is very dependent on literacy rates.
Absolutely.
Although as we get more and more visual,
Just a family quota. But first, I was going to say that it would be nice if 20, 30 years after it started, the domino theory in Southeast Asia really took effect, except not the way people originally were using the concept. My question is, given the economic progress and the interaction with the outside world and the tremendous tourism and so forth, what is the cause of the frustration and anger with the government that you said is mounting, especially since I assume the younger generation has not known days when there was all sorts of political parties and maneuvers, and so that's what they've known. Why is there this frustration, and how could it be used?
Whenever you open up an economy in a country run by a one-party dictatorship, you open the door to rampant, pervasive corruption. The lack of the rule of law, the horrendous problem of corruption. And on top of that, the level of social inequality in Vietnam is also have been increasing many times. So yes, when you open up the economy, the country is moving forward. Yes, there are segments of the population that do well or even prosper, but there are many, many others who are not doing well, who are victims of corruption, who are victims of land grabs, just like.
So it's like China.
Exactly. And these are the people who are very, very angry.
I think also the religious persecution is a huge factor. I mean, once you realize that in the outside world you can practice Catholicism how you want, I mean, it's a big shock. I think if you're inside the country, you can't. I think religious freedom is a very important factor right now.
And more recently, another, just to build on top of what we had just said, yes, religious freedom and other basic human rights, also another source of frustration. And more recently, the way the Vietnamese government is handling the conflict with China over the territorial issue of the northern border, as well as, we call it the EC, but commonly known as the South China Sea. The way they handle that conflict really have caused a rift within the party itself. There are members of the party who are frustrated and angry the way the nation is handling the problem. So that is another source of dispute. And this time, though, fortunately for us, it comes from within the party, rank and file as well.
Can you elaborate on how the Hanoi regime has been handling the China issue?
Yes, they basically, back in 1999 and 2000, they signed two border treaties, one on land and one at sea. And basically, as a result, Vietnam had lost about 11,000 square miles at sea and about close to 1,000 square miles in the northern border. On top of that, Vietnam and China, and among other countries, also have been contesting ownership over the Spratly and the Paracel Islands. And so far, the Vietnamese government have been pretty much yielding to the pressure from China, unlike other countries that have taken a much stronger stand than the Philippines, for example. Last summer, people were so upset that they mounted a series of 11 protests in Hanoi and Saigon against the way they handled this issue. And I think it makes people even more angry when it became known that yielding to Chinese pressure, communist Chinese pressure, the Vietnamese government cracked down on the protests and arrested a number of protesters. And that made people even more angry, more frustrated. Okay.
Speaking of religious freedom.
Sure, please.
Hi, Scott Flipsy from the Commission on International Religious Freedom. So the question would be, is it possible, is it possible to have an event similar to the Saffron Revolution in Burma in 2007 happen in Vietnam? And do you see it possible in any way? Is there a time horizon? Is it Catholicism, given with the way that the Catholics are sort of, particularly the Redemptorists, are sort of moving out publicly? They're moving out in front of the bishops. Catholic laity is moving out in front of the bishops. But that the Saffron Revolution is something we need to talk about. And while I do think that the generals' opening is basically because they want a better deal from China, right? They weren't getting the deals they thought they were on pipelines and gems and other issues because of their isolation. But in a sense, the Saffron Revolution gave a moral sort of indignation and a moral rebuke of the monks against the generals. You no longer have the mandate of heaven. No matter what you say, you've lost the moral sort of connection to the people of Burma. And that, in a sense, coalesced all of the sort of democracy movements, dissidents, ethnic minorities, others, particularly Buddhists, against the generals. They had lost that sort of ability. Cyclone Nargis just sort of helped them along. So is it possible in Vietnam to see a similar event?
The very honest answer is that I think change will come in Vietnam, but it's not, my prediction or my guess is not going to be the same. It's what we have seen in Burma may not happen in Vietnam. Every country, as you know, is going to be different. The situation is not going to be the same. So something similar like that in Burma, my viewpoint, the likelihood of hitting that in Vietnam is pretty low. Vietnam will change. Again, like I said, it will change, but probably different approach, go down different path. The reason I said that is I have seen, witnessed how effective the Vietnamese government is in controlling the region. They really the master of controlling social activities, religious organizations, social organizations. They have been quite successful in persecuting religious leaders, anybody outside their control. They have been quite successful. So, given that constraints that we're operating with right now, I in the near future, I don't see something similar in Burma will happen.
Yeah, well, in Burma, as you know, one of the driving forces is the fact that the monks are integrated so deeply in the daily lives of everybody in Burma. So the saffron revolution started with oil prices and housewives and the whole thing, but when it really blew open was when they decided to beat up poor monks on the street and let the blood flow on the roads. I mean, that's what really made it blow up, and it's because religion was so integrated, is so integrated into their everyday lives. I don't see that in Vietnam, maybe I'm wrong, but in Burma, I know that everything you do requires a monk's blessing. So,
But I'm thinking about it more in terms of the elements of civil society needed to sort of spur change. Because in every area, in every place where there is change in recent history, there's been civil society movements that have grown, whether it's in Eastern Europe, which is the most relevant model, I suppose. It's Solidarity, it's labor unions, it's the Catholic Church, it's the Hungarian Reformed Church, it's in both Romania and Hungary. It's democracy movements in Czechoslovakia of artists and other folks. Again, it's the notion of where does the spring of civil society come that gives life and voice to sort of movements for change, and also support people willing to die, in a sense, for what they believe is a need for change. Where is it going to come from? When are they going to converge? So the follow-up question is so Catholicism is fairly unified, even though the bishops are behind the laity in some respects, but on some of the land issues they've been unified. Is there a sense where they're moving towards a convergence with other civil society Protestants? I know some of the lawyers in Hanoi sort of working with Catholics. So again, it's a nascent issue, very nascent in Vietnam. But is it something that we're working towards, and is it a possibility?
Well, first of all, I just want to make it clear, I don't want to take away what the Catholic Church is doing right now, or the Unified Buddhist Church is doing right now. They have been, for the longest time, have been the voice, the moral voice. They have been fighting for religious freedom, and they're both living everything. Yes. But the reality is that the Vietnamese government have come down, especially under the Unified Buddhist Church. So in that sense, I don't see a religious-led type of a revolution like the Saffron Revolution in Burma. But having said that, that doesn't mean that religious organizations do not have a role to play in Vietnam, or they have not been already doing so. As far as a convergent issue, okay. As far as a convergent issue, that's a very big question. That's the key question that we have to ask: what's going to mobilize people? What's going to bring people together? Is it corruption? Is it the land grab? Is that the China issue? What's the thing? Yeah, what's the thing? Right now, there are many issues going on in Vietnam, and let's just say all of these are being utilized, maximized, and eventually it will come to a point. There will be a single issue, or maybe a couple issues that's going to be the key ones to that.
Just to do this one, back to your question. Scott mentioned the role of these religious groups, right, in various countries, but maybe we take a step back. It's the role of sort of civil society, independent associations, and fostering change and creating the pressure. So take a place like Vietnam, where civil society is still nascent. How can you have to change without civil society? It's sort of a chicken and egg thing. I mean, you need to have to change to have a civil society, but if you don't have a civil society, how do you have to change? I mean, how's that logjam broken through your chicken and egg here?
Well, if you want to hear your viewpoint in Burma first, then probably get.
I think that what we're touching on is that moment where the pockets of many civil societies come together and converge over one event or one issue. And I think that's what we're talking about in Vietnam because there are a lot of groups that are in themselves civil societies, but they have to come together when they're to meaningful change. And I think the communication and the information flow is critical now, so that religious activists and democracy activists and everybody knows what everyone else is doing and what's happening throughout the country.
I come from a camp that I firmly, personally believe that the development of civil society is absolutely critical, not just for the long run to build a foundation for sustainable democracy, but also in the immediate future, because social groupings, civil society organizations play a key role in triggering change and facilitating change. So yes, Scott is right. That in Vietnam is still in the developmental process. However, again, it's up to you. It's how do you see? Is it a glass half full or half empty? From someone like me who had been involved in this cause for the last 25, 30 years, longer than I care to say, I have to say this. Yes, it's developing. It's moving along, and more groups in Vietnam are taking control, breaking away from strict government control, and they are trying to assert themselves, assert their position, and try to move the change process along. Of course, people in Vietnam are very careful. The moment they give the government any reason to come down, they will be crushed. So they have to dance around and be very careful, but they are there. They are in their own way, subtle way, try to move the process along. And I've seen that, I have witnessed that, and I believe that we'll continue to take a stronger football and will turn people. Yes, please.
Well, I just would like to hear your panelists speak about what the appropriate role, in their view, is for the United States government in terms of influencing a positive effect on the kind of change you're discussing. Do you think there is a role, and if so, do you see it as a carrot or a stick or a combination, or what?
Well,
We spoke earlier, we decided that this would be his question.
Okay.
well, thank you.
Because it is not my place.
Yes. Okay. I'll be glad to answer the question. Yes, I think the U.S. Certainly has a very important role. And in all fairness, the U.S. has been engaging both in Burma and in Vietnam as well. I mean, clearly, in the case of Burma, the U.S. has been the leading voice advocating for isolation and targeted sanction. The blacklist that the U.S. government put together of hundreds, if not thousands, of members of the ruling elite in Burma and sanctioned them in terms of their mobility, their transfer of assets, and all of that. I really think it did help. It does help. And after the U.S. put together the blacklist, the EU followed suit, and they have a blacklist too, and that helped. So I think in that sense, the U.S. did play a very key role in facilitating, at least help to bring about change that we see right now in Burma. In the case of Vietnam, the U.S. has been a strong voice promoting human rights, trade, as well as resolving the issue out of South China Sea. So the U.S. certainly has a very strong role to play, and it has been playing that role. Now, from my perspective, do we want to see more? Yes, always we want to see more. In my numerous meetings with members of Congress, as well as the State Department, NSA, and so on, we have always been pushing for more. But at the end of the day, I totally understand that change has to come from the Vietnamese people. In the case of Burma, it has to come from the Vietnamese people. We are the one who has to do the bulk of the work. The U.S. or the international community does have a role to play, but it is our job. We have to do it.
One of the differentiators is because of Burma's situation, there were more carrots that could be offered. With Vietnam, there's not that situation. It makes it tougher, but
Sure. I mean, basically Burma was sanctioned, so there's a lot of carrots provided.
lots of carrots.
Let me ask you this. So I think the consensus here is change has to happen from within that country. It can't be all, come from external forces. So the change in Burma right now, is it top down or bottom up?
Maybe you want to take a stand first?
From where I sit, I think it's both.
Okay.
I think that there there was a lot of pressure from the bottom, obviously, starting from the Saffron Revolution, which was exacerbated by the anarchists, and Wayne Upton reacted to that. But also, it was top down because of the dependency on China. And, frankly, they weren't moving forward, as a nation. And I think that the U.S. taking an active role in ASEAN was, a key motivator also to show that the U.S. is engaging. I think that was a really good sign and helped.
Burma, top down or bottom up?
I agree with Libby, and it's really hard. In reality, it's really hard to separate top down versus bottom up. At least from what I have seen, rarely do we see in a dictatorship that change came solely from the top. Whether it's a change of heart or for some other motive, it's very rare. Most of the time, the top down or the change that we see from the top actually come as a result of pressure either from within or from the bottom up. So it's more of a cause and effect relationship. And I really think that the pressure from within and from the bottom is very, very important, because without that, change may not turn out to be the positive change. But actually the change process actually serve in favor of the government or the regime. So that, having said that, the two go hand in hand, and once the pressure from the bottom or from within is strong enough, in a way it forces the top to have to make adjustment. And when they do that, it actually facilitates the transition to democracy.
Yeah, this reminds me of something that you mentioned earlier, which is causing a rift in the ruling party. Because I recall that during the Saffron Revolution that there was a rift in the junta because of the attacks on the monks, because many of the people in the ruling party were distressed by the activities of their own party. So it is really important to recognize that, although it is a one party ruling, fist, that it's made up of individuals, and those individuals have, connections to the various aspects of society, and that's what we have to focus on.
Yes, definitely.
So what I'm hearing is, it's not just one man, one leader in Burma that's sort of into Gorbachev leading all these changes, but it's reflecting the pressures from the grassroots and also from previous efforts like the Saffron Revolution in 2007. So, are we seeing things in Vietnam today that in, say, 2, 3, 4 years, analysts will say, well, it's because of these events today that have led to the changes, of 2015 or so?
Oh, that's a tough question.
In Egypt, right? Now people are saying, well, it's not just things that happen, at Tahrir Square, but there's, a bunch of bloggers who acted on Facebook 3 years before that organizing. So, are there little seeds right now in Vietnam that people can someday come back and say, this is the moment when the change is happening right now?
Yes, there are many seeds in Vietnam. I remember, again, being involved for quite some time. I remember back in the 80s and in the 90s, we had some very rare voices of dissent. Brave individual, men and women, who spoke out and said, look, we need to change. Vietnam needs more human rights and so on. And immediately they got shut down. And that's it. And there was this long, eerie silence that lasted sometimes 4 or 5 years before we see someone else daring it up and come out and say, it's time to change. What's happening in Vietnam over the last 5 years amazes me. Over the last 5 years, hundreds of people have been arrested. And guess what? Every time they have a wave of crackdown, more people start coming out, challenging the government. It amazes me that I have to say the level of political persecution in Vietnam during the last 5 years is unprecedented compared to the last 10 years. And yet more and more people are coming out challenging the government. So they are the beautiful seeds of democracy. On top of that, we have seen groups coming together. The group that came together to protest the bauxite mining in Vietnam. People who organized the 11 protests last summer against how they handled the conflict with China. These are the seeds. And the government, I don't think they have reached a point where they can no longer really silence these people, because every time they arrest someone else steps up to them. And that is really have given me hope. These people, they understand.
And I think the mobile phones, the cameras on the mobile phones, the internet, all of that is really powering individuals in Vietnam, because there's not a tree that can fall in a forest anymore, and that's critical going forward. I think we will look back and say, oh, it was these years when the internet really took off. They went from 0 to 27 million online in 2 years.
It used to be where media was very much one way, right? You broadcast the news, everyone would just listen to your news. I mean, like Radio Free Asia, you feel an element of like participation with people on the ground or contributing to your news?
Oh yeah, completely. I think that just from citizen participation, we could put the program on.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just so much interaction, on all our Facebook pages and the YouTube daily news broadcasts. We get republished or put on different blogs all over the place. And people are really utilizing media, to share ideas and to come together. I mean, that is a way to create a community by finding people with common ideas.
Again, speaking from our own experience, a lot of time we would organize protests in South Vietnam, whether it's for religious freedom, whether it's for anti-corruption, or whether it's for fair wage. Every time we organize protests and we talk to people who are participating in these protests, we said, like, we talk to Radio Free Asia, they want to interview people on the street. Immediately people say, yeah, I want to talk to Radio Free Asia. Give it to me, give me the phone to me, I want to talk to them. Yeah.
It's great, it really is.
Yes, sir. Back.
Hi, I'm Andre Silvajo, and I'm just the chief representative for a company in Malaysia marketing water purification equipment into Vietnam, hoping we get it in there. The company is Arteron, and I also represent an American company in Michigan, but that's a long time. But anyway, great discussion, appreciate it. But I have a question. Back to the the question of the conflicts in the Eastern Sea, and including the Chum Sa and those areas on the continental shelf and within the 200 nautical mile extended economic zone that Vietnam have, the Philippines have, I guess Malaysia has some. But anyway, the question is this. I think it was your discussion, sir, that you pointed out some nuances there in how much Vietnam is willing to stand up to the Chinese aggression into their extended economic zone, and how much they're willing to coerce, to deal. And I've seen so much of both, I mean, because I'm in Hanoi a lot in my business, and I read every day the daily papers like Thanh Niên, Port Chair, and all that. And so I see all of it like you do, and you see sometimes like you said the boxing or the boxing, how do you call it? Yeah, a bunch like
Yes, the Vietnamese production.
But the yielding so much to China on some things like that, and I think, oh my gosh, why? But then, apropos to the comment that when the Vietnamese people in Hanoi got out to demonstrate, I was invited to attend one of the demonstrations in front of the Chinese embassy. I didn't
Did
go.
you go?
but the chicken out, but the popular revulsion against the Chinese aggression, and then leading to demonstrations that the Vietnamese put down or didn't allow to develop more. But then that's coupled with the fact that the Vietnamese press itself, the openness with which they reported these things, spurred that. And I was reading every day, in Thanh Niên or Poi Che, details. And so I was curious, could I find the same level of detail in the New York Times or the Washington Post, which you get online, even in Hanoi, by the, the Financial Times from the UK? It was all very superficial compared to the Vietnamese press, which had the details of when the Trung Quốc là cắt cáp của Bình Minh Không Hai, một cách trắng trợn I should say
Maybe I didn't translate it now. I was paid to translate it, but okay.
You know what I mean? They cut the cable of
Right.
the Bing Ming Kong Hai right in the middle of the night and harassed it and all that. And they were just doing a peaceful survey of their own mineral resources and over their own economic EEZ. So why be so open? And even other things that have nothing to do with Vietnam per se, like the conflict between Tokyo and China.
So the question is, why
The
is the
question
state
is why?
media covering these
Yeah,
issues?
that's the question. Why?
But the government regime seems to be a little bit weak on responding. Is that the?
Well, because to me, I mean, that's why I'm
Seems to
waiting
be
for
like
you.
almost like a conflicting.
Well, that's what I'm asking. Do you see that as a question, Professor, is do you see that as supplementing, as supplemental efforts towards a strategic policy, which is sort of my take on it, but you're the professor, not me, and I just.
Well, I'm not a professor, but
Anyway, but you're the, you know this. And I just thought, well, maybe it's supplement because it seems like Vietnam's playing for time in a very wise session to, that is to diversify the relationship with other countries like India and the Obama administration. And so don't go too fast because you bite off more than you can chew, but then bide your time, just like with India. You remember that China sent what do you call a diplomatic note to Prime Minister Singh saying, don't implement that. If you implement that contract with Petro-Vietnam, it'll impair the relationship with China.
So if I can just attempt to paraphrase, so what we're seeing is in the Vietnamese state media, per the gentleman, they are reporting on some of these, conflicts with China, and
apparently very open,
yeah,
front
openly.
about it. Yeah.
So, and it seems like the Hanoi government is taking sort of a calibrated response on how far they're pushing. So, what do you make of this? Is their policy the right one? I mean, what's going on?
To be honest with you, I am not surprised to see that kind of reaction in Vietnam. And here's the reason why I'm not surprised. Number one is that the Vietnamese government knows full well that if they appear to be kowtowing to Beijing, they are dead. They're dead. They know that. So on the one hand, they have to somehow maintain this posture of standing up to protect the government sovereignty and all of that, so that they can calm down the resentment and frustration of the people. But at the same time, the moment they go to Beijing, it's a different story. It's a different story. So I think it is a convenient tactic for them, like you said, buying time. They want to tread lightly and try to walk a tightrope. On the one hand, keep the population at bay. On the other hand, try not to infuriate Beijing. And that is a very, very delicate, difficult situation they are in.
But at the same time, they're developing these relationships, right?
Yes.
With India and the United States.
And the reason for that is because the Vietnamese Communist Party is not a party. It is not. There are different factions within the party. Like I said, there are factions within the party that are not happy themselves with the way the leadership is handling China. So yes, I don't discount the fact that they also, as a hedging their position, they want to look elsewhere. And again, just like the Burmese leadership, it is a very uncomfortable position to become so dependent on another country outright, politically and economically.
It's perfectly reflective of the ambivalence in the government.
And I think what we're seeing in Vietnam is that there's a lot of popular opposition to the government's policies or concerns about China. I think Vietnamese authorities have been sort of stifling some of those voices. I mean, you mentioned the protest. Can you sort of elaborate on how Vietnamese authorities have been handling popular pressures on China?
Like I said, I mean, on the one hand, they talk tough. They went out. They buy all this weapon from Russia and India, and as if they get ready to fight again. So they talk tough and do all that posturing. But on the flip side of it, they quietly single out people who they suspect to be the instigator for these protests, quietly arrest them. And then the most famous case is Wu Minghang, who was sent to a re-education camp just because she's one of the key instigators for these protests. So that's how they do it.
I think there's also some element of the protests. When they shut down the protests, it's about civil unrest. You know, there's a very strong line against any kind of civil unrest. So it may not be entirely tied to the underlying protest, but just the fact that people think that they can protest, I think that's what causes a severe backlash. So that contributes to the ambivalence that you see in the press.
I just want to quickly add before you ask your question. Now, what I think is interesting is that the Vietnamese constitution is due for a new facelift coming up in 2 years. But there have been talks about what about the law allowing people to protest? Okay, what about law that allow people to organize into an association, into an organization? What about law concerning the free press and all that? So it will be very interesting to see what's going to come out from all of this discussion about this new constitution we're going to see in 2 years.
Well, I mean, as we know, you can have laws on the books, but they're not
Whether
necessarily
you- yeah,
change anything if
exactly.
there's no rule of law.
Yes.
I'm Sophie Duong from the Vietnam, Washington, D.C. radio and the air 24/7. So we have a lot of political programs from different organizations. So right now, for the last 3 weeks or four weeks, there is a conflict between political program that I have it from Vietnamese American here. You know, most of them, I see that most of them, they say that, you know, they keep calling Vietnamese American listener to ask U.S. to put Vietnam back to CPC, and then a small political organization keeps saying, oh no, you know, we should not put Vietnam back to CPC. So which way that both of you think, since you have a lot of experience and after I heard your discussion, so which way is the best way for Vietnam to change? So I want to hear from Mr. Lim and from Libby too, because Mr. Lim is a Vietnamese American, so maybe his thinking is different than Libby, or maybe both of you will be the same, but I just want to hear, you know, what you think.
I
So
don't think I can opine on this one.
Yeah, okay.
So the CPC is the country of particular concern, which is a State Department sort of blacklist for countries that are deemed to be severe violators of religious freedom. So Vietnam used to not be on the list, so it was put on the list and was taken off the list. So that's
Yeah, I think, first of all, right after that, I would say that I think it's long overdue that Vietnam needs to go back on the CPC list. Simply for the fact that they cannot continue to violate religious freedom freely like what they're doing right now. They just can't. It's just against the norm.